Hey everyone, it's Paul Giroux, paulfgiroux.com. I'm a portrait wedding photographer and Sony artisan based in Wisconsin. And in this video I'm going to be talking about the A1, some of my thoughts about this camera. It was announced about 2 weeks ago. I have not had one in hand, but I am really excited to get one. And I wanted to talk about some of the features that make it special, some of the things that come out of those new features, and who is this camera for and how do you justify it. So thanks so much for watching. The Sony A1 to me is the realization of the dream that I've always had about Sony cameras since they first came out. Back in 2014 when I switched for the Sony a6000, I had hoped that there was going to be a camera just like this that would allow me to shoot high resolution stills, incredible high quality video, and do it at a way that was just like insane speeds. I mean, at the time I switched, the a6000 was a $650 camera that had 11 frames per second, and it was really sophisticated for the time and led me to believe that this is where this company hopefully might go, and they certainly did. So there's some new developments with this camera. I mean, actually improvements, things that they've created specifically for this camera. It's one of the things that makes Sony so great is that they can make the sensors, they can make the motors for the lenses, they can make the processors. I mean, they cover the whole ecosystem of this camera, much like what Apple is doing with the M1 chip in their computers. So now Sony has really hit, I think, the top of the peak when it comes to this camera. This camera is their best to date, and it's going to set the standard going forward. So there are three things that I wanted to talk about specifically that the camera came up with. The first thing is the new sensor, and that has high resolution stills, 50 megapixels, as well as 8K video. That's a big deal. It's the first time it's ever been in a Sony camera that we've got 8K. The new processor handles 30 frames per second with 120 calculations per minute, so it's incredibly fast. And the A9 II and the A9 both did 20 frames per second. They did it with an incredible finesse because you could actually photograph sports at 20 frames per second silently with no mirror blackout, and now this camera gives us even more at 30 frames per second. And the third piece that I wanted to talk about was the new mechanical shutter, and this thing allows a still photographer such as me who still uses flash to make photos outside that would have been really tough to do because we would have had to gone to high-speed sync mode, which has its problems in terms of minimizing power output and things like that. Now we can go up to 1/400th or 1/500th in APS-C size with this new mechanical shutter, which is a combination, a computer combined with mechanical. And while it's 10 frames a second mechanical shutter, it gives me that extra speed when it comes to flash sync. Now this is very useful for pros, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So those three things are three of the, I think, the peak of the development with this camera and things that they had to create in order to make this camera special. The processor is huge because it's so much faster, and it allows the sensor to take those 30 frames per second at 50 megapixels and clear the buffer with them in a speed that we've never seen before with the Sony cameras. So what this means is the ability to switch from stills to video, which I've got to test, will hopefully be a lot faster because of the speed increases in the processor, but also the way that the buffer clears, which allows you to go to the menu or do something like crop to APS-C while the buffer is still clearing. Those are things that come with the advantages of the new processor speed. So that's a very important thing. In essence, this camera is the kitchen sink camera because it's got it all. And it's the combination of three cameras that Sony's got at their top of the lineup right now. The a7R4, the high resolution 61 megapixels camera, and then there's the A9 II, which is the sports photographer's camera, which is 20 frames per second, and it has a filter, a anti-flicker filter in mechanical, which was an add-on from that A9, which it did not have that. And then the recently announced A7S III, which is kind of the video-centric beast that has 4K 120 all-eye, writes to SD cards, as well as Compact Flash Express A type cards. And I talked about how Sony controls the ecosystem with regards to the way that these cameras are made, and that's the truth when it comes to the A7S III, and that was one of the things that became clear to me is in 2019 when the A7R4 was announced, we had hoped that, many of us had hoped that that was going to be the A7S III. Instead, it was the A7R4, but it came with things like autofocus audio through the MISU, which is very cool and continues with these subsequent cameras. But at the time, they had not developed a way to dissipate the heat that was going to be generated when you do a 4K 120 file. And they had to come up with that. So Sony came up with not only that, but they also came up with the Compact Flash Express A cards, which fit into the same form factor as the SD. The camera was designed from the back forward, so Sony decided that the camera's got to do everything we want in these size parameters. So it's not going to be bigger than any other camera. It's got to be the same size as the R4, the A9 II, and everything's got to fit because batteries work the same way, grips work the same way with these what I call version 3 cameras. Well, this camera does that. It fits in the same form factor as the A9 II, the A7R4, and the A7S III. So all the batteries, the grips, they all work together. It's got eye autofocus and video. It's got 4K video. So we've got the best, and sometimes even better than what we've got in the previous version 3 cameras. We don't have the resolution of the A7R4. That's 61. This is 50. But I think because of the improved sensor, I think that will be kind of a wash. I don't think it's going to really matter that much. And frankly, I'm glad that it's a little smaller. 61 was a little bit big. I kind of like the 42 megapixels of the A7R III, but just a little bit bigger. It can clear the buffer a lot faster, means that it's going to be a great thing. The other thing to consider is that computers that we're using are now going into the stratosphere. So video files that we've been working on in 4K and even 8K will be able to be sliced through by these new sensors like the M1 sensor on the Apple, and also the high resolution files then should be easily handled because 50 should be a piece of cake with the new native Lightroom for the M1 chip and the silicon chip. So I'm looking forward to having that not be a problem anymore for me. So those are big deals. So we've got the best of all possible worlds, and we've added 15 stops of dynamic range in stills and 15 and a half in video. And if you check out Gerald Undun's review, which I'll link below, you can see what that actually means in real terms. He actually says it's better in terms of dynamic range than the A7S III, which was very, very high, and something that he really thought was superb at that time. Now it's even better. You would think too with a 50 megapixel sensor, well, this means the high ISO performance is going to be bad or not as good as it might be with the A7S III, but it's surprisingly good according to the reports that I've seen. The new processor also gives us less rolling shutter, and this is a big deal when it comes to still photographs that are made at 30 frames per second in silent shooting mode. Now, other camera companies have silent shooting mode, and that's great, but are they really an effective silent shooting mode? And I could even say this about some of the other Sony cameras that aren't the A9 or the A9 II, because you have to be very careful in certain situations because you might get rolling shutter if you pan too quickly, or you might get a kind of a funhouse mirrors effect if you don't hold real steady, or if the subjects move too quickly. And you also have to be careful about some of the lighting at the shutter speed. You might get some banding and really strange color because of just the way that it works with the electronic shutter, which you don't usually get that in mechanical shutter. So the fact that Sony added the anti-flicker filter with the mechanical shutter of the A9 II when that came out is a great deal. But one of the things that they've done with this camera, not only have they reduced the rolling shutter, but they've put an anti-flicker filter into electronic shutter. That's the first time that anybody's ever done that. Plus, you've got minimized rolling shutter, less distortion when like a ball is in the photograph or when a golf head is in the shot. All of those things add a lot to the quality of the still image that we're getting from these cameras compared to maybe other cameras that have high frame rates with silent shutter. But is it the same? And that's the only thing you have to do is check that to make sure. This camera will be the top of the heap when it comes to that. The improved weather sealing will be a gift. They've made these increases with every subsequent generation. They've made the buttons bigger, a little quieter, still keeping that same smaller form factor, but they've worked to seal them better so that there's less chance of any kind of outdoor damage to the camera. One of the things that they've done is improve the EVF in this camera. Now it has the same 9 million plus dots that the A7S III has, and it also has the ability to reduce the magnification. So what that means for people who wear glasses when they're looking in the EVF, they'll be able to see the entire image of the EVF. They won't have to be cropped off inside, so there's ability to kind of zoom in and out, which is very helpful. It also has a refresh rate of 240 frames per second. So now that's twice as fast as what we saw with the A7S III. So that's going to mean even more lifelike, more real, a more optical-like experience. And they've gotten better and better and better. And one of the things that they've done with this EVF too, it's to set there's a setting that allows you to do slow shutter EVF and pan without a lot of the kind of the blurring you might get when you're doing a car panning or a skier panning or something like that, where you want to get a kind of an artistic slow motion with blur effect, which is very handy. Another thing that they've done in still mode is add bird eye autofocus. So now we have human, animal, and now bird. I need to try it. I need to check it out. I've seen some reports online that show it doesn't quite function like they had hoped, but I don't know if that's because of the way the camera was set up. And that's a big thing when it comes to shooting action. And some folks would buy this camera because of the frame rate, and with the long optics that we have with the 400 and the 600, the 200, 600, 1:4 and stuff like that for animals and wildlife, it'll be a perfect camera for that, especially for the bird photographers out there. Videographers will love the Syntone profile that's now PP11 with this camera, so that matches what the FX6 and the FX9, much more expensive, more cinematic centric cameras that will get out of the A1 will go in the same direction as the FX6 and the FX9. So as a B or a C camera, they should match up very, very well, and that's going to help in post-production. It has the full range of cinema profiles, which the A9 II did not have. So we've got a sports camera with high resolution, and we've got cinema profiles, much like the A7S III. So that's a big deal. It's one of the things that I wish they would have always had on the A9 II, but they never did. Now we've got HLG, we've got S-Log 2 and 3, and we've got that Syntone S on this new A1, and that's going to be great and welcome for video and cinematographers. Lossless compressed RAW file. So now there's 3 types of RAW. The only thing I wish that they would have added would be a medium and a small RAW, which would help wedding photographers because they don't necessarily need those 50 megapixel files of people dancing. They might want to get them, but they probably don't need them. But there's also the 10-bit HEIF, which is a holdover from the A7S III, and that's a 10-bit small compressed file that's smaller than an 8-bit JPEG, and it's the kind of format you often see with your smartphones and things like that. Full frame sensor is 50 megapixels, but the APS-C crop is 21 megapixels, which is only 3 megapixels less than what the A9 II is currently. What that means for photographers who want to crop in, they've got a lot more real estate to move in. So it helps videographers, but it also helps still photographers, because now if they don't need to shoot a full frame 50 megapixel photograph and they want to crop it in a little bit tighter in camera so they see it through the EVF, then they can go to 21 megapixels and you've got a really beefy APS-C. It might very well be now the best APS-C camera on the market because of all the developments. I often will do that with my A9 II, which means I go from to a 10 megapixel, and that still gives me a 3900 pixel wide on the widest side photo. This is going to be a lot more. This will be probably just under 6,000, so probably around 5,400, I'm guessing, 5,500 pixels on the wide side. But that's going to be big because then significantly, if you want to cut back in what your file sizes are, whether in RAW or JPEG, you can just go into APS-C, and that'll give you that little bit of an alternative in terms of the way that the image looks. There's an APS-C mode for video, which means that it's oversampled from 5.6K down to 4K, and that is the Super 35 APS-C size, which a lot of cinematographers like because it's what they've become accustomed to in their careers shooting that. Full frame is becoming more popular, I guess you could say, in filmmaking, but APS-C has been the standard for a long time, or Super 35. So this camera is not cheap. It comes in at just under $6,500, and that's a big bite, especially in the year of the pandemic. But I give Sony a lot of credit because what they're doing is continuing to push and evolve, which will only help the subsequent cameras that come out, but also the cameras that come behind. They may get firmware upgrades that will give us these kind of features that hopefully we can upgrade to on like the A9 II. Will it get bird eye AF? That would be awesome. I don't know if it will, but pushing the development is a great thing. One of the things I like in Sony too is a distinction that I heard from a runner back in the 70s. His name was Marty LaQuarrie, and he was a 4-minute miler in high school. And he was always chasing Jim Ryan, who was a high schooler who broke the 4-minute mile in 1964, I think it was. And LaQuarrie wanted to beat Ryan. He wanted to get it on the Olympic team, and he wanted to be ranked #1 in the world. And by 1971, I believe it was, he was ranked #1. And he had been chasing it for years. And he said in an interview, he said it was really interesting to run not to lose rather than running to win. And I've always felt like Sony has always been running to win. As they've pushed and pushed the big two, Canon and Nikon, as they've pushed to really create products that people really want and are really unique. And the A6000 is the kind of camera that helped fuel the innovation of the Sony ecosystem, because so many people bought that camera and still buy it today, that it helped put money into R&D so that I have the benefit of it in the A9 II, the A7S III, and the A7R4, in addition to this new A1. This camera is for pros and advanced amateurs, although people who really love photography and videography will find great benefit to this camera. Can they justify it? Well, some may not be able to. If you're strictly a videographer, the A7S III may be all you need, or an FX6 and an A7S III. The money spent on an A1 may be better, on Alpha 1 may be better spent on an FX6. That's something that they have to decide. I happen to love the camera, the DSLR style, the 35mm style camera form factor for everything. And I love being able to shoot high quality stills and 8K, 4K video with this camera. It really is the way I love to work, and it's been kind of a dream of mine to be able to do these kind of things with this type of camera. So for me, the A1 is something that I will add to my A9 II and my A7S III. Ideally, I'd love to have 2 of them and maybe an A7S III, but right now this will be the one that I'll get for now to learn it, take advantage of it, because with every new camera comes a bit of a learning curve as we try new things and push the limits and test it. So for sports photographers, 30 frames a second is a significant upgrade. 20 is fast, and I'll tell you, you get really spoiled when you shoot 20, because after you've shot 10, 12, maybe 15, 20, you'd think, well, that's not that much faster, but it really is. And you just have more shots at the brass ring when you're shooting sports. When you have 20 frames a second, 30 is only going to be better. 20 allows you to get maybe 3 cracks at a receiver catching a ball. Now maybe I'll have 4 or 5 with 30, or running and having a chance to have a runner with his feet off the ground as they're driving the lane in basketball. And just having more surety in autofocus, which we're getting with this. It's 30% more sure. It's got a better real-time tracking autofocus that is more sticky, but it also allows me to reposition to another subject very quickly, which is something that's nice to have, and it's an upgrade from what the A9 II is. So those features for sports photographers are big. The other thing that may not sound as a big thing for sports photographers is the new mechanical shutter. Having 1/400th and even 1/500th of a second with APS-C with a mechanical shutter, when you're shooting strobed basketball or strobed hockey or other strobe, volleyball, things like that, means that you're going to have less chance for ghosting, less chance for any kind of blurs, and you're going to be able to stop action better. So that's a big deal, because the A9 II the A9 II had a sync speed of 1/200th of a second, but to be safe, you might have to go down to 1/160th of a second. Now you're at 1/400th, and I hear that it's a solid 1/400th for even using a remote like a Pocket Wizard, which is the standard issue for a lot of indoor sports strobe photographers. And it may be the camera that gets photographers from Getty to switch to Sony after using Canon or Nikon, because of that extra high-speed sync that nobody else has. It also means for portrait shooters the ability to maybe use a smaller, less powerful strobe that's less money, less weight, and less cumbersome on the job. So instead of carrying a 400, I might be able to carry a 200 watt second flash and give the same equivalent look because of the fact that it has one extra stop of power because of the higher flash sync in mechanical mode. That's pretty great. Now somebody may say, well, why wouldn't you just use high-speed sync? Well, you might think that that's the obvious answer, but in some ways it's not, because high-speed sync really, when you're trying to use high-speed sync and the shutter goes higher, the power goes lower, and you really can't get a deeper aperture like an f5.6 or an f8 out of high-speed sync without really pushing your camera hard, or I'm sorry, your flash unit hard. And the other thing is you don't often get a lot of power, like say you're trying to shoot at f1.8, 1/1000th of a second in deep shade just to get a little pop of light. Well, that's going to be fine with high-speed sync, but when I'm shooting a group or I'm trying to balance daylight or overpower daylight, then those settings just won't work. Or if I need a little bit more depth of field because I'm photographing 2 or 3 people, I need f5. I just can't do that in anything other than full manual mode, and that means I don't have to go into high-speed sync. So that's a big deal. Landscape photographers will appreciate the extra megapixels. It's not as high as the A7R4, but the dynamic range is improved, and 50 megapixels should give incredible quality when doing large blow-ups in metal, canvas, or even just standard prints. So landscape photographers will appreciate that. Interior photographers, architecture photographers will love the additional size. And if they don't need those big files, they can crop to APS-C, and therefore they've got a 21 megapixel. They could do a full frame RAW and then have a small medium JPEG to accompany it that would only be 21 megapixels, so that would give them the ability to transmit photos and send them quite easily. And speaking of transmitting photos, this camera has got an improved Wi-Fi interface. It has the ability to send photos from the camera via Ethernet, also via a 100 gigabit per second USB-C, and also an improved Wi-Fi experience, so that there's 2 antennas now with this camera that allows you to send photos faster to your phone. And with the new Xperia Pro, you'll be able to do live 5G live view broadcasts from the camera, which is really, videographers will really appreciate the 8K. Well, at least I think they might. I mean, it may be a little bit of overkill for some people, but the 4K codecs from the A7S III are in this camera as well. And then you've got the APS-C Super 35 offerings that give you some flexibility that you didn't have with the A7S III. So 8K might be overkill, but I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of if I was a hybrid wedding filmmaker where I shot stills and video, being able to shoot 8K of the kiss might be great because I could get video of it, and then if I want, I could grab a 32 megabyte file of a freeze frame. So that might be an interesting way to use this 8K in a mode that maybe they didn't consider. I've always thought that someday there might be a chance where we're shooting video at 8K and just grabbing stills that we mark with the shutter release button, or we just pull out of an edit. I mean, it's going to be a lot of data, that's for sure, but it might be a way around those situations where you want to shoot stills and video at the same time, and know that you could get both by grabbing a freeze still image from your 8K video. So that might be something that we'll see down the road, who knows. And finally, I wanted to talk about wedding photographers, because 50 megapixels might be a little bit of overkill for wedding photography. It's a lot of information, especially from things that aren't the portraits and even the ceremony. That's a lot of stuff. 24 megapixels has always been kind of the sweet spot for me. I love that size. I think it's just great. But you can also crop in with APS-C to get 21 megapixels. So for wedding videographers, this new camera might be a little bit high in terms of megapixel count, 50 megapixels, but with the ability to go to APS-C to get 21 megapixels or use JPEGs or HEIF files that are 10-bit, that might be the answer to it. They might just be very, very selective in terms of the way that they use 30 frames per second. Instead of using that for the whole day, maybe you just use that for the processional, the recessional, the first kiss, and things like that, the first dance, where you really want to have a lot of images to choose from. But the rest of the time, you maybe are at 5 frames per second or even 10 frames per second. So all of those things are great. I want to have the ability to shoot 8K video with it, and if I want to do 50 megapixel portraits, I've got it. I will use it in conjunction with the A9 II and even the A7S III as I do wedding photography going forward. So that's it in a nutshell. This camera is going to be the new flagship of Sony, and it is the realization of many of our dreams of getting a camera that is high megapixel, high incredible burst rate, and amazing 4K and, in this case, 8K video. And I think it's going to be a camera that many photographers throughout many genres, commercial, portraits, weddings, will adapt, as well as video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please leave them below and let me know, are you going to be getting the Sony A1? Let me know what you're going to do with it. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you later.